In the autumn of 1883, a letter found its way from the forgotten folds of the map to the desk of a man of God. The paper was thin, almost translucent with age and worry. It was sealed not with wax, but with a dark smudge that might have been soot or dried blood. The script inside was a frantic, spidery crawl, the words of someone who had forgotten the patient art of penmanship, whose hand was guided by a terror so profound it shook the very ink into jagged, broken shapes. The letter promised the impossible, and it asked for a priest. If these are the stories that call to you, join our community of fellow investigators by subscribing. Father Elias Hargrove read the letter 3 times in the dim light of his study in St. Louis. He was a young man, but the duties of his office had settled on him like a coat of fine dust, making him seem older than his 31 years. He was a man of logic and scripture, of established rites and documented miracles. He believed in the frameworks of his faith, the ancient walls built to keep the darkness at bay. The letter spoke of a darkness that did not seem to follow the rules. It spoke of a boy in an isolated Missouri valley named Grayson Hollow. A boy named Samuel Thorne, who had been born into the world as a vessel of silence and had remained so for 7 years. He had never cried, never laughed, never spoken a single word, until a month ago. The letter claimed the boy now spoke, but the voice was not his own. It was a deep, rasping tone, a sound like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. A sound, the terrified letter writer swore, that belonged to a man named Elias Carter, a mill worker who had drowned in the Grayson River 10 years prior, his death shrouded in the kind of quiet suspicion that only small, forgotten towns can cultivate. A possession, the letter pleaded. A classic case of demonic intrusion. But the details did not sit right with Father Hargrove. The specificity of it, a single dead man's voice. Not legions, not ancient tongues, just the ghost of one local tragedy clinging to the throat of a silent child. He packed a small bag containing his vestments, a vial of holy water, his Bible, and a heavy, leather-bound book of rites. He told his superiors he was taking a leave of absence to attend to a pastoral emergency. He did not show them the letter. Some things, he had learned, were best kept from the archives until they could be understood or defeated. The journey to Grayson Hollow was a slow peeling away of the world he knew. First, the cobbled streets of the city gave way to muddy tracks. Then the tracks dissolved into little more than a deer trail winding through the Ozark Hills. The land grew steeper, the trees thicker, their branches knitting together overhead, until the autumn sun was a fractured, distant thing. He rode for 4 days, the world growing quieter with every mile. The chirping of birds was replaced by the lonely call of a raven. The rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth seemed to follow him. He felt as though he were not traveling to a place, but descending into it. On the evening of the 4th day, he saw it, the valley. Grayson Hollow did not present itself. It was revealed suddenly, a great shadowed bowl carved into the earth, ringed on all sides by impenetrable bluffs of granite and pine. A thin ribbon of mist clung to the valley floor, obscuring whatever lay within. It looked like a place that time had overlooked, or perhaps a place that had deliberately turned its back on time. As his horse picked its way down the treacherous path, a profound sense of isolation washed over Father Hargrove. This was not merely a town without a railroad. This was a world unto itself, with its own secrets, its own memories, and its own ghosts. The town, if it could be called that, was a sad collection of unpainted wooden buildings leaning against each other for support. A general store with a sagging porch, a blacksmith's forge dark and silent, and at the very center, a small, white church with a leaning steeple. Its paint was flaking, a pale skeleton against the dark woods. People watched him from behind parted curtains. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. No one greeted him. They simply observed his arrival, another piece of the outside world drifting into their closed system. A woman, her face a roadmap of worry, met him at the door of the small rectory next to the church. She introduced herself as Martha Thorne, Samuel's mother. She was the one who had written the letter. Her hand trembled as she gave him the key. She spoke in a hushed, rushed whisper, her eyes darting towards the woods, towards the river, towards anywhere but his own face. She said the boy was at home. She said he had been quiet all day. She told him the voice came and went as it pleased. It was worst at night, she said. Worst when the sun went down. She explained that the rectory had been empty for years, but they had cleaned it for him. She said she would bring him food in the morning. Then she hurried away without another word, as if the air around the church was poison to her. The rectory was cold. Not the crisp, clean cold of an autumn evening, but a deep, damp cold that seemed to rise from the floorboards and cling to the very air. It smelled of wet stone and something else, something vaguely aquatic and unpleasant, like river mud left to dry in a dark room. There were 2 rooms. A small sitting area with a fireplace that looked like it had not been used in a generation, and a bedroom with a narrow cot and a small writing desk. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from the grimy window. Father Hargrove set his bag down. He ran a hand over the rough wooden desk, his mind already sorting through the possibilities. Hysteria, a shared delusion in an isolated community. A clever prank by a troubled child. He was a man of reason first, a warrior of faith second. He had to eliminate the natural before he could confront the supernatural. He sat on the cot, the springs groaning in protest, and opened his book of rights. The Latin was a comfort, a language of order and power, a fortress of words. He would see the boy in the morning. He would speak with the family, with the townspeople. He would find the rational explanation. He had to. The alternative was a violation of the natural order he had sworn to uphold. Night fell on Grayson Hollow like a lid on a box. The darkness was absolute, a thick, starless blanket that swallowed the valley whole. The silence was even deeper. It was a weighted silence, pressing in on the thin walls of the rectory. Hargrove lit a single candle, its flame a tiny, defiant pinprick against the oppressive gloom. He tried to read, but the words on the page swam before his eyes. The house settled around him, groaning and creaking like a great, sleeping beast. He could hear the wind whispering through the cracks in the walls. He was tired from his journey, his bones aching with a weariness that was more than physical. He lay back on the cot, his cassock still on, his mind a whirlwind of doubt and prayer. He must have drifted off. He was not sure for how long. He was woken by a sound that was not the wind and not the creaking of old wood. It was a voice. His eyes snapped open. The room was pitch black. the candle having burned itself out. He lay perfectly still, straining his ears, telling himself he had been dreaming. And then it came again, closer this time. It was a whisper, yet it filled the tiny room. A voice that was low and guttural, thick with a resonance no child could ever produce. A voice that sounded as if it were being dredged up from some deep, wet place. It spoke a single word, his name. Elias. It came from the unlit hallway just beyond his door. His heart hammered against his ribs. He was not dreaming. He sat up, his hand instinctively reaching for the crucifix around his neck. He called out, his own voice sounding thin and weak in the oppressive silence. There was no reply, only the profound, waiting quiet. He stood, his legs unsteady, and felt his way to the door. He pushed it open, peering into the inky blackness of the sitting room. Nothing. He held his breath, listening. And that is when he heard the second sound. It was soft, rhythmic. The gentle, unmistakable sound of splashing water. It was not coming from outside. It was not rain. It was coming from somewhere inside the walls of the house. A slow, steady drip, as if a leak had sprung deep within the structure. But it was not a drip. It was a soft, continuous lapping, like a small, private tide rising and falling in the dark. He stood there, frozen in the hallway, the cold of the floor seeping into his bare feet. The letter had promised him a possession. It had promised him a demon, an enemy he knew, an evil with a name and a history written in the very book he carried. But as he stood there in the dark, listening to the voice of a drowned man call his name and the impossible sound of a river inside the walls, Father Elias Hargrove felt a cold certainty grip him. This was not the work of a devil he had studied. This was something else, something born of the water and the soil and the long, bitter memory of the valley itself. This was something far, far older. The cold light of morning did little to burn away the residue of the night. Father Hargrove had not slept again. He had sat in the dark, a silent sentinel in a house that seemed to have a tide of its own, listening to the impossible lapping sound from within the walls until, with the first gray hint of dawn, it had simply faded away. The silence it left behind was somehow more unnerving. He was a man who relied on the solid architecture of reality, on the predictable progression of cause and effect. Last night, reality had felt like shifting sand beneath his feet. He had come to Grayson Hollow to confront an evil he understood, a named adversary from the pages of his scripture. But the voice in the hall and the river in the walls felt like something else, a different kind of scripture entirely, one written in water and stone and rot. He knew he could not delay. The fear was a living thing, and if he allowed it to fester in the quiet of the rectory, it would consume him. He had to face the source. He had to face the boy. He found Martha Thorne waiting for him on the steps of the church, a basket in her hands. She did not meet his eyes. She spoke to the ground, her voice a low monotone, as if all the emotion had been leached out of her. She told him Samuel was in the old parish schoolhouse, the small, one-room building that stood behind the church. She said it was quiet there. She said the boy was waiting. She handed him the basket of bread and dried meat and a small flask of water, a transaction conducted in near silence, then turned and walked away, her shoulders hunched against a weight he could not see. Hargrove watched her go, then took a deep, steadying breath. He was a priest. He was an instrument of God. He would not be ruled by the shadows of a haunted house. He walked toward the schoolhouse, his footsteps loud in the morning quiet, each one a deliberate act of will against the creeping dread. The schoolhouse was a single, long room filled with the ghosts of children's voices. It smelled of chalk dust, old paper, and the faint, sweet scent of decaying wood. Rows of small, empty wooden desks stood in silent formation, their surfaces scarred with the carved initials of students long since grown or gone. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, fell in long, solemn bars from the tall, arched windows, illuminating the room in a way that felt more funereal than educational. At the far end of the room, sitting at the teacher's larger desk, was the boy, Samuel Thorne. He was small for his 7 years, with a shock of pale blonde hair and eyes the color of a washed-out summer sky. He was not looking at anything in particular, his gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance. He sat perfectly still, his small hands folded neatly on the desktop. He looked less like a child and more like a piece of forgotten porcelain, delicate and empty. Hargrove approached slowly, his boots echoing on the worn floorboards. The boy did not turn. He did not blink. There was no recognition in his eyes, no flicker of fear or curiosity. It was like approaching a statue. Hargrove pulled up one of the small student desks, its size making him feel large and clumsy. He sat opposite the boy, the teacher's desk a wide, wooden battlefield between them. He began as his training had taught him. His voice was calm, gentle, the voice he used for frightened children and grieving widows. He asked the boy his name. He asked him his age. He asked him about the birds he liked to draw, a detail his mother had offered in a rare moment of reminiscence. To every question, there was only silence. The boy's pale blue eyes remained fixed, his expression a perfect, unnerving blank. Hargrove felt a familiar frustration begin to build. This was a wall he knew how to scale, the stubborn silence of a child. He leaned forward slightly, his voice still soft. He said he had come a long way to help. He said he knew something was wrong. He said he was not there to punish, only to understand. He placed his hand on the desk, a gesture of peace. It was then that he saw the boy's throat move, a slow, deliberate tightening of the muscles. The small jaw worked, not with the natural movement of speech, but with a stiff, mechanical motion, as if operated by unseen gears. And then the voice came. It was not the voice of a 7-year-old boy. It was the sound he had heard in the dark hallway of the rectory, a low, gravelly rasp that scraped the air in the silent schoolhouse. It was the voice of an old man, filled with a bitterness as deep and cold as a winter well. The boy's lips moved, but the sound that emerged was an ancient violation of the senses. It said its name was Elias Carter. It said it remembered the priest's name from the night before. Hargrove felt a cold shock, a jolt as if he had touched a live wire. He kept his face a mask of professional calm, but inside, the foundations of his reason were cracking. He asked the voice what it wanted. The voice gave a dry, rattling laugh that seemed too large for the boy's small chest. It said it did not want anything. It said it was simply waiting. Hargrove, gripping the crucifix beneath his cassock, pressed on. He asked about the drowning. The letter had called it an accident. The voice in the boy's throat scoffed, a sound of pure contempt. It said there had been no accident. It said it was a punishment. The entity, speaking through the child's mouth, began to recount the story. It did not speak like a demon boasting of its power. It spoke like a man giving a final damning testimony. It described the night, the lack of a moon, the cold that bit at the bones. It named the men, not as demons, but as neighbors, farmers, the blacksmith, men of Grayson Hollow. It spoke of how they had dragged him from his small cabin, their faces hard and set in the lantern light. It said they had called him a sinner, a blight on their valley. It described being pulled toward the river, the cold mud sucking at his boots. The voice did not waver. It was a monotone of pure, distilled hatred. It described the shock of the Grayson River in late autumn, an icy fire that stole the breath. It said they held him under the black water. It described the weight of them, the relentless pressure. It spoke of the burning in its lungs, the desperate, silent scream for air. And then it added a detail that made the blood in Hargrove's veins run cold. It described the view from beneath the surface, looking up at the distorted shapes of the men. It described seeing their boots on its chest, the worn leather, the mud caked on the heels, pressing down, holding it in its cold, watery grave. The priest sat frozen, his hand clenched so tightly around his crucifix that the metal dug into his palm. This was not a generic tale of damnation. It was a memory. A horrifically vivid, personal memory of a brutal murder. He was not speaking to a demon. He was speaking to a ghost. A ghost still saturated with the cold of the river and the burning hatred for the men who had put him there. The interview ended as abruptly as it began. The voice simply stopped. The boy's jaw went slack. A flicker of something, a brief light of awareness, passed through his eyes, and then was gone. He was once again the empty, porcelain doll. Hargrove stood, his body trembling with a mixture of righteous fury and profound theological terror. This was not in the Book of Rights. There were no prayers for appeasing a murdered man's spirit, no rituals for casting out a memory. He left the schoolhouse, the weight of the drowned man's story heavy on his shoulders, and retreated to the cold silence of the rectory. He spent the rest of the day in a state of agitated paralysis. He paced the small rooms, the floorboards groaning under his feet. He tried to pray, but the words felt hollow, inadequate. The neat categories of his faith, good and evil, demon and angel, heaven and hell, felt like a child's drawing of a world that was, in reality, a chaotic, violent, and deeply unjust place. The ghost of Elias Carter was not a fallen angel. It was a product of human sin, a stain that had seeped into the very soil of Grayson Hollow. That night, the darkness returned with a vengeance. The wind howled around the rectory, and Hargrove could almost believe he heard whispers in its cry. He could not bring himself to sleep on the cot. He sat at the small writing desk, the candle flame sputtering, trying to document what had happened, trying to impose the order of written language onto the chaos of the day. He needed paper. He had used the few sheets he had brought. He remembered the desk had a drawer. It was old and warped, and he had to pull at it with both hands, the wood screeching in protest. It was mostly empty dust, a dead spider, a few bent nails. But in the back, pushed into a corner, was a small, flat tin box. It was rusted along the edges, the kind of box a soldier might use for tobacco or a child for treasures. He could see faint pry marks along the lid, where someone had forced it open long ago. He lifted it out. It was heavier than it should have been. With a sense of grim inevitability, he worked his fingernails under the lid and pried it open. The contents lay on a bed of yellowed, decaying fabric. The first object was a pocket watch. It was a simple, silver-plated timepiece, its surface now a mottled mess of rust and tarnish. The glass face was a spider web of cracks. The hands were frozen at 2:15. It was clearly, unequivocally broken, a dead piece of machinery. Beside it, nestled in the fabric, was a thin, folded strip of linen. It might have been a handkerchief or a piece of a christening gown. It was yellowed with age, but on it, embroidered with faded blue thread, was a name: Thorn. The name of the boy, the name of the family that had summoned him, a connection, a physical link between the family and whatever artifacts these were. His training screamed at him to close the box, to take it to the church, to sanctify it. But a colder, more curious part of him, the part that had been awakened by the voice in the schoolhouse, took over. He picked up the watch. It was cold to the touch. The mechanism was clearly visible through the cracks, a mess of rusted, immobile gears. It was a dead thing. On a morbid impulse, he lifted it to his ear. He expected only silence. He heard a tick. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a tiny metallic whisper against his ear. Tick, tick, tick. A steady, rhythmic heartbeat from a dead machine. His own heart stopped. He pulled it away, staring at it, his mind reeling. It was impossible, a trick of the ear, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. He held it to his ear again. Tick, tick, tick. It was real. An impossible, terrifying reality. He was so focused on the watch, on this violation of natural law, that he did not hear the air behind him shift. He did not feel the temperature in the room plummet. He only heard the voice. It did not come from the hallway. It came from right behind his shoulder, a low, wet murmur, so close it felt as if it were being whispered directly into his soul. It said two words that shattered the last of his composure. It said, "You brought it back." Father Hargrove slammed the rusted tin box shut. The impossible ticking sound was instantly silenced, cut off as if it had never been. He was left in the profound, ringing silence of the rectory, his own ragged breathing a deafening intrusion. He spun around, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The room was empty. The cold air was still. The voice that had whispered from behind his shoulder was gone, leaving no trace of its presence but a lingering phantom chill on the back of his neck. He stood there for a long time, a statue carved from fear, his knuckles white where he gripped the small metal box. The tidy, rational world he inhabited, a world of scripture and canon law, of observable phenomena and established doctrine, had been breached. The enemy was not laying siege to the walls. It was already inside, whispering secrets in his ear and winding the springs of dead machines. He spent the remainder of the night in a state of tormented vigilance. He did not sleep. He did not pray. Prayer felt like a child's plea in the face of an ancient, indifferent Leviathan. His faith was not gone, but its foundations, which he had always considered to be solid granite, now felt like brittle sandstone. He sat at the desk, the book of rites open before him, but the Latin text seemed a foreign language, the words of a man who had never stood in a cold room and heard a dead man speak his name. The evidence was a chaotic, terrifying mess. A ghost that could recall its own murder with perfect clarity. A ghost that knew the intimate details of his own past. A ghost that could interact with the physical world, leaving a ticking watch as its calling card. His training, his entire theological education, screamed at him that this was impossible. Ghosts were echoes, psychic residue. They did not possess. They did not manipulate. That was the domain of the demonic. And in that thought, Hargrove found a sliver of terrifying comfort. A demon was a known quantity, an ancient and powerful enemy, yes, but one with rules of engagement, with weaknesses to holy water and sacred names. A demon was a soldier in a war he had trained his entire life to fight. This other thing, this lingering, intelligent, and deeply personal memory of a murdered man, was a horror for which he had no name and no weapon. He made a decision in the cold, pre-dawn hours. He would treat it as a demonic possession. He would force it into a framework he understood. He would perform the rite of exorcism, not as a cure, but as a diagnostic tool. He would hold up the cross and the holy water, and he would demand that the entity before him show its true face. He had to believe that face would be one of a fallen angel, because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. When morning came, he went to the Thorn home, a small grim cabin that seemed to shrink under the shadow of the surrounding woods. He found Samuel's father, a man named Thomas, splitting wood by the door. His movements were slow, mechanical, the actions of a man operating on memory alone. Thomas Thorne's face was hollowed out by sleeplessness and despair, his eyes holding the dull, vacant look of a man already defeated. Hargrove explained his intentions. He spoke of the need to confront the entity, to challenge it on holy ground, to use the ancient power of the church to force it into the light. He spoke with a conviction he did not feel, his words a performance meant to reassure both the grieving father and himself. Thomas listened without expression, the axe resting limply in his hand. When Hargrove was finished, the man gave a single, slow nod. He would bring the boy to the church after sundown. There was no hope in his eyes, only the grim acceptance of a man willing to try any last, desperate measure. That evening, the church of Grayson Hollow was transformed. It was no longer a house of quiet prayer. It was an arena, a spiritual cage prepared for a battle. Hargrove worked with methodical precision, his actions a physical manifestation of his attempt to restore order to his shattered worldview. He lit every candle on the altar and in the nave, dozens of them, their combined flames pushing back the encroaching shadows, filling the cavernous space with a warm, flickering light that felt both sacred and deeply fragile. The air grew thick with the smell of melting wax and incense. He prepared the holy water, mixing the blessed salt into the cool liquid, the tiny crystals dissolving like dissipating sins. He laid out his stole, its embroidered gold thread gleaming in the candlelight. He placed the heavy crucifix in the center of the altar. Each object was a weapon. Each gesture was a prayer. He was arming himself, not just with the symbols of his faith, but with the very idea of its power. Thomas Thorne arrived just as the last of the sun's light died behind the western bluffs. He led Samuel by the hand. The boy was as he had been in the schoolhouse, placid, silent, his pale blue eyes staring into nothing. He showed no fear, no resistance. He simply allowed his father to lead him to a single wooden chair placed before the altar, a throne for a tiny, unwilling king. Thomas knelt in the first pew, his head bowed, his hands gripping the wooden rail in front of him so tightly his knuckles were white mountains. He was not praying, he was bracing himself. Hargrove took his position before the boy, the book of rights held open in his hands. He took a deep breath and began, his voice strong, filling the church with the ancient, sonorous power of the Latin verses. Exorcisamus te omnis immundus spiritus. He commanded the unclean spirit to reveal itself, to name itself, to depart from the vessel it had defiled. For a long moment, there was only the sound of his own voice and the soft crackle of the candles. Samuel sat perfectly still, his blank gaze fixed upon the crucifix on the altar. Hargrove felt a cold spike of doubt. Was he a madman, shouting incantations at a sick child in an empty church? He moved to the next step. He dipped his fingers into the bowl of holy water and reached forward to anoint the boy's forehead. The instant his wet fingers touched Samuel's skin, the placid doll shattered. The boy's body went rigid, his back arching so violently it lifted him from the chair. A low hiss escaped his lips, a sound of steam from a ruptured pipe. He began to convulse, his small limbs thrashing against the wood, not with the chaotic energy of a seizure, but with a horrifying, unnatural rhythm, as if an invisible puppeteer were yanking his strings. And then came the voices. At first, it was a sound so unexpected it made Hargrove recoil. It was the voice of a child, thin and reedy, and filled with a desperate terror. A voice no one in Grayson Hollow had ever heard before. It whimpered a single word, "Mother." It was a plea, a tiny flicker of the real Samuel Thorne drowning in the internal darkness. But it was instantly choked off, replaced by the other voice, the deep, grating rasp of Elias Carter, which erupted from the boy's throat in a sound of guttural laughter. It was a sound of pure, triumphant malice. Hargrove, his heart pounding, pressed on. He raised the crucifix, holding it before the boy's contorted face. He shouted the prayers, his voice rising in power, a desperate assault against the entity. Carter's laughter stopped. The voice grew cold, quiet, and insidiously personal. It stopped fighting the ritual and began to fight the priest. It spoke of a winter long past, in a small parish outside of Boston. It spoke of a girl with brown hair and a laugh like tiny bells. It spoke her name. Sarah. Hargrove froze, the Latin words dying in his throat. It was his sister's name, his sister, who had been taken by a fever when he was just a boy. The voice of Elias Carter, in its dry, dead rasp, began to narrate the last days of his sister's life. It described the precise pattern of the frost on her bedroom window. It recalled the smell of the eucalyptus and boiled linen in the sick room. It quoted, word for word, the phrase the old doctor had used, a phrase that had haunted Hargrove's dreams for 2 decades. He had said it was a pneumonia of the lungs, a fire that could not be quenched. The voice described the sound of her final, shallow breaths. These were not guesses. These were not the vague pronouncements of a soothsaying demon. These were his memories, his most sacred and painful secrets, being pulled from the depths of his mind and thrown back at him in the voice of a dead man. He stumbled backward, his carefully constructed armor of faith and ritual shattering like glass. The crucifix felt heavy and useless in his hand. The entity was not just in the boy, it was inside his own soul, feasting on his grief. It was in that moment of his faltering that Thomas Thorne let out a choked cry. Hargrove turned to see the man collapse from his kneeling position, slumping to the floor in a heap. The priest, his own terror momentarily forgotten, rushed to the man's side. Thomas Thorne's face was ashen, his eyes wide not with fear, but with a look of horrific, dawning certainty. He had seen something Hargrove had missed. He grabbed the priest's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. He pulled him close, his breath a ragged, desperate whisper against Hargrove's ear. He said that it was not the devil. He said that it was him. The words hung in the air, a new and more terrible prophecy. The exorcism was over. It had failed spectacularly, not by being defeated, but by being rendered irrelevant. Hargrove helped the broken father carry his now limp son out of the desecrated sanctuary and back to the dark silence of their cabin. Hours later, the priest sat alone in the rectory, the ticking of the broken watch the only sound. His book of rights lay closed on the desk, a relic of a war he was not fighting. He was lost in a wilderness far more terrifying than the Ozark Hills outside his window. A flicker of movement caught his eye. He looked out the window toward the churchyard, bathed in the cold, indifferent light of the moon, and he saw him, Samuel. The boy was standing in the middle of the cemetery, his small form a pale silhouette against the leaning headstones. He was barefoot on the cold, damp earth. He was standing over a grave, but he was not praying or grieving. He was simply standing there, looking down. Hargrove's blood ran cold. He knew every plot in that small yard. There had been no burials for months. The ground at Samuel's feet was not a neat, settled mound of earth. It was a dark, ragged patch of soil. It looked as if it had been freshly disturbed. It looked as if something had been dug up, or as if something had tried to dig its way out. The image of the boy in the moonlit churchyard was burned into Father Hargrove's mind. It was a tableau of impossible horror. The small, barefoot child standing over a patch of freshly disturbed earth, a silent sentinel guarding a desecrated grave. The priest had not gone out to him. A profound, instinctual fear had held him rooted to the spot, a fear that told him he was no longer a minister of God confronting evil, but merely a witness to a process he could not comprehend, let alone stop. He had watched until the boy had turned and, with an eerie, dreamlike slowness, walked back to his family's cabin, leaving the dark scar on the earth behind him. The failed exorcism had not banished the entity. It had solidified it. It had proven that the power of the church, the ancient words and sacred symbols, were like stones thrown into a bottomless river. They made a sound, a ripple, and then they were gone, swallowed by a depth that was absolute and indifferent. The entity in Samuel Thorne did not fear the cross. It feared nothing. It was not an invader. It was a claimant. It believed it had a right to be there. The priest's theological world was in ruins. He was a soldier whose weapons had turned to dust in his hands. The enemy he faced was not in his books, not in the doctrines of his faith. To understand it, he realized he could no longer look to Rome. He had to look to the soil and the water of Grayson Hollow itself. He needed a different kind of scripture, a local gospel written not in ink, but in memory and rumor. There was only one person in the valley who might possess such a text. The next morning, leaving his Bible and his book of rights on the desk like discarded tools, he walked away from the church, away from the center of the town, and took a narrow, winding path that led deeper into the woods, towards a small, isolated cabin where the oldest resident of the valley lived. Her name was Agnes, and she was the town's midwife. She had brought most of the current residents of Grayson Hollow into the world, and she had seen most of their parents out of it. She was a living archive of the valley's secrets. Agnes's cabin was small and low to the ground, seeming to grow from the earth rather than sit upon it. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a thin gray finger pointing at the overcast sky. The air around it smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and drying herbs. He found her sitting on her porch in a rocking chair, her gnarled hands methodically stripping leaves from a bundle of herbs in her lap. She was ancient, her face a web of deep-set wrinkles, but her eyes were startlingly clear and sharp, the color of river glass, reflecting the gray light with an unnerving intensity. She did not seem surprised to see him. She watched him approach, her rocking never ceasing, as if she had been expecting him all along. He introduced himself, his title feeling strange and hollow in this place. She just nodded, her gaze unwavering. She knew who he was. Hargrove, feeling like a schoolboy before a stern teacher, began to speak. He did not talk of demons or possession. He spoke of history. He asked about Elias Carter. For a long time, the only sound was the rhythmic creak of the rocking chair and the soft rustle of the herbs in the old woman's lap. Then she began to speak, her voice a dry whisper, like leaves skittering across stone. She told him that Elias Carter had not been a well-liked man. He had come to the valley from somewhere back east, a man with no family and a shadow in his eyes. He worked at the old grist mill, a solitary figure who kept to himself. But there were whispers. Whispers about his interest in things a man of his station had no business knowing. Dark books, strange symbols carved into the trees around his cabin. And then there were darker whispers still. Rumors that he had a fondness for children, an unhealthy one. A few of the town's girls had spoken of him, of his strange kindness that felt cold and wrong, of small gifts left on their windowsills. No one ever proved anything. There were no witnesses to any crime. But in a place like Grayson Hollow, suspicion was a seed that grew fast in the dark, fertile soil of fear. The men of the town, she said, had decided that Carter was a blight, a sickness that needed to be cleansed from their valley. They held their own kind of trial, a trial by moonlight and whiskey and righteous fury. They dragged him from his cabin one night, down to the cold, black water of the Grayson River. They did not intend to drown him, she said, her voice dropping lower. They intended to scare him, to hold him under until the sin was washed out of him and he agreed to leave the valley forever. But the river had its own ideas. It was a hungry river, she murmured, a river that had a way of keeping what was given to it. There was a struggle. The water was cold and fast. Carter was gone. No body was ever recovered. The men returned to their homes, silent and sobered, having traded one kind of sin for another. Hargrove listened, his mind racing, fitting the pieces together. The ghost's own testimony, the midwife's history, they were two sides of the same bloody coin. But he still did not understand the connection to the boy. Why Samuel Thorne? Why a silent child born years after Carter's death? He asked the midwife this question, his voice barely a whisper. Agnes stopped rocking. The sudden silence was deafening. She looked directly at him, her river glass eyes seeming to peer right through him, into the fearful chambers of his heart. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur that the wind seemed to carry away as soon as it was spoken. She told him that memory in a place like Grayson Hollow was a funny thing. It did not always stay in the minds of the living. Sometimes it seeped into the ground, into the water. Sometimes a life cut short was too stubborn to simply end. She told him that no one ever talked about it, that it was a piece of the story the town had chosen to forget. But she remembered. She had been the one to deliver Samuel Thorne. She remembered the night he was born. She remembered the date. It was exactly 3 years to the day after the night the men had taken Elias Carter to the river. And she remembered something else. Something Thomas and Martha Thorne had never spoken of. Something buried under a mountain of shame and grief. Samuel had not been born in their bed. He had been conceived on the hard, cold ground by the riverbank, on the very night that Elias Carter had been screaming his last, watery breath into the mud. The implication struck Father Hargrove with the force of a physical blow. It was a piece of folk horror, a pagan superstition that had no place in his structured theology, and yet it felt more true than anything in his books. That the boy's life had been sparked in a moment of desperate passion at the exact same location, at the exact same time, that another life had been violently extinguished. That perhaps, in that violent transference of energy, something had passed from the dying man to the nascent child. Not a soul, not a demon, a memory. A raw, undiluted, and hateful memory that had lain dormant, waiting for the child to grow old enough to give it a voice. He felt a profound, sickening sense of vertigo, as if the ground beneath him had fallen away. This was not a possession that could be exorcised. This was the boy's very origin story. The entity was not a parasite. It was a part of his foundation. To cast out Carter would be to unravel the very fabric of the boy's existence. He thanked the midwife, his voice a hoarse croak. He stood to leave, his mind a storm of terrifying new ideas. As he turned to walk away from the cabin, Agnes spoke one last time, her voice returning to its normal, whispery cadence. She told him to be careful of the things he carried. She said some objects, like people, held on to memories, and that the river had a long reach. He did not understand what she meant until he was halfway back to the rectory. He had left the rusted tin box locked in the drawer of his desk. He had not touched it since the previous night, but as he walked, his hand brushed against the pocket of his heavy wool coat, and he felt a small, hard object inside. His blood turned to ice. He stopped, his hand trembling as he reached into the pocket. His fingers closed around the cold, tarnished metal of the broken pocket watch. He pulled it out, staring at it in the gray afternoon light. It was impossible. He knew, with an unshakable certainty, that he had left it behind. Yet here it was. On a whim of pure, morbid dread, he lifted it to his ear, and he heard it. Louder this time, deeper. Tick, tick, tick. A patient, relentless heartbeat, counting down to a reckoning he could not begin to imagine. The river had a long reach, she had said, and its memory was now ticking away in his own pocket. The ticking of the broken watch became the new tormenting rhythm of Father Hargrove's existence. He did not put it back in the box. He did not throw it away. He felt, with a primal certainty, that it would be a futile gesture. The object was no longer a mere piece of metal. It was an anchor, a physical manifestation of the connection that had formed between him and the entity. To discard it would be like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. The watch would simply reappear in his pocket, on his desk, under his pillow, a constant, ticking reminder of the unnatural laws that now governed his reality in Grayson Hollow. The knowledge he had gained from the midwife, meant to illuminate, had instead cast a deeper and more profound darkness. He was a physician who had finally diagnosed the disease, only to realize it was woven into the patient's very DNA, and that any attempt at a cure would be an act of murder. His visits to the Thorn cabin became a ritual of helpless observation. He would sit with the boy for hours in the oppressive silence of their small, dark home, a home that felt perpetually damp, as if the nearby river had seeped into the very wood of its walls. The entity of Elias Carter was growing stronger, more present. The periods of silence from the boy grew shorter. The voice would emerge now without provocation, a low, gravelly monologue that filled the small rooms with its cold bitterness. It no longer spoke of its own death. It spoke of the town. It would recount old slights, forgotten debts, whispered insults from decades past, a litany of the small sins and petty cruelties that formed the hidden history of the valley. It spoke with the authority of a man who had watched from the shadows for years, cataloging every transgression. Samuel Thorne's body, meanwhile, was beginning to change. His posture, once the straight, pliant posture of a child, was beginning to stoop, his shoulders rounding as if under an invisible weight. His gaze, once vacant, now held a glint of Carter's cold, calculating intelligence. At times, Hargrove would see a flicker of the true Samuel, a brief, terrifying moment of lucidity in the boy's eyes, a look of pure, unadulterated terror, the look of a prisoner peering through the bars of his own skull before being dragged back into the darkness. The people of Grayson Hollow, however, did not see these subtleties. They saw only the escalating strangeness, the failure of the priest's first attempt, and the growing fear that a great evil was nesting in their midst. They were simple people, their faith as hard and uncomplicated as the rocky soil they farmed. They understood the devil, the ancient enemy. They did not understand the nuances of a parasitic memory or a vengeful ghost. A small delegation, led by Thomas Thorne, came to the rectory one evening. Their faces were grim, their voices low and demanding. They had tolerated the priest's quiet, scholarly approach. Now they wanted a different kind of war. They wanted a public exorcism. They wanted to bring the boy into the church, before the eyes of the entire congregation, before the eyes of God, and wage a final, decisive battle. They believed that the combined power of their faith, a chorus of righteous prayer, would be a tide that could wash the demon out. Hargrove tried to argue. He tried to explain, in the simplest terms he could manage, that the entity was not a demon, that a public spectacle would only provoke it, that it would feed on their fear. They did not listen. They saw his reluctance not as wisdom, but as weakness, as the failure of an outsider who did not understand the stakes. In their eyes, he was now not just a failing priest, but an obstacle. Thomas Thorne, his face a mask of desperate resolve, told him that the ritual would happen, with or without his cooperation. Hargrove, looking into the faces of the frightened, angry men, saw the same blind certainty that had led them to the riverbank 10 years ago. He realized he had no choice. He could lead the ritual and attempt to control the chaos, or he could step aside and watch the town tear itself apart. He agreed. The night of the second ritual, the entire valley crowded into the small church. Every pew was filled. People stood in the aisles, their bodies pressed together, a mass of humanity radiating a palpable aura of fear and grim determination. They clutched rosaries and homemade wooden crosses, their faces upturned toward the altar, pale and sweating in the oppressive heat generated by their own bodies and the dozens of flickering candles. The air was thick and close, heavy with the smells of unwashed wool, candle wax, and the damp, earthy scent that seemed to follow Samuel Thorne wherever he went. This was not the sacred, contemplative silence of the first exorcism. This was the charged, volatile atmosphere of a public trial, of a witch hunt waiting for its spark. When Thomas Thorne led his son down the central aisle, a collective gasp went through the crowd. The boy looked smaller, more fragile than ever, yet he walked with an unnerving confidence, his head held high, his pale eyes sweeping over the congregation with a look of cold amusement. It was the look of a king surveying his subjects. Hargrove began the rite, his voice amplified by the unnatural silence. But he knew it was a farce. He was an actor, speaking lines in a play whose ending had already been written. As he spoke the opening prayers, the entity in Samuel did not wait for the anointing. It began to scream. It was not a scream of pain or fear. It was a ragged, triumphant scream of pure, unleashed rage. The sound ripped through the church, a physical assault that made people recoil and cry out. The boy's body convulsed, but this time, he did not fight it. He seemed to embrace it, his small form a conduit for a furious, ancient power. Then, the scream subsided, replaced by the grating voice of Elias Carter, now amplified, booming through the nave as if from the mouth of a prophet. And he began to name them. He pointed a small, trembling finger into the crowd, his eyes locking onto a terrified farmer in the third pew. He spoke the man's name and accused him of stealing grain from his neighbor 20 years ago. The farmer let out a sob and collapsed, his wife trying to hold him up. Carter's finger moved, landing on a woman near the back. He accused her of spreading a malicious lie that had ruined a young girl's reputation. The woman shrieked, her hands flying to her face as if to ward off a blow. One by one, the voice moved through the congregation, unearthing buried sins, long-forgotten transgressions, the secret, shameful history of the valley. It was a torrent of confession, a forced reckoning. People began to weep, to shout denials, to accuse one another. The solemn assembly devolved into a chaotic mob. The sacred space transformed into a pit of recrimination and hysteria. In the midst of the chaos, the church itself seemed to turn against them. The heavy oak doors at the back of the nave, which had been propped open to allow for the overflow crowd, slammed shut with a deafening boom that shook the entire building, plunging the room into a claustrophobic trap. The candles on the altar flickered wildly, their flames dancing as if in a gale, casting long, monstrous shadows that writhed on the walls. The air, already thick, became fouler, the scent of damp earth intensifying until it was the overpowering stench of a freshly opened grave. Hargrove stood frozen before the altar, a helpless observer as the town's collective guilt was weaponized against it. The ritual was not an attack on the entity. It was a stage for the entity's final performance. He looked at Samuel, who was now standing on the chair, his small arms outstretched as if conducting the symphony of chaos around him. And as he looked, Hargrove saw something shift in the boy's eyes. It was not a demon leaving. It was not a spirit being cast out. It was a memory returning, a final, crucial piece of the puzzle slotting into place. The convulsions stopped. The booming voice of Carter fell silent. A new quiet, more terrifying than the screams, descended upon the church, and then the boy spoke. But this time, it was not the voice of a child, nor was it the voice of a dead man. It was both. It was Samuel's own thin, reedy voice, a voice no one had ever heard, yet it was layered with the cold, wet resonance of the river. It was a horrifying harmony of innocence and damnation. He began to describe a sensation. He spoke of the feeling of cold hands on his shoulders, holding him down. He spoke of a great weight on his chest, of the burning in his lungs, of the taste of mud and dirty water. He was not recounting a story he had been told. He was describing a memory as if he were living it for the first time. He was describing the sensation of being drowned. In that moment, Father Hargrove understood the final, terrible truth. The first voice, the voice of Carter, was the memory of the man's anger in his life. But this was the memory of the death itself. It had laid dormant, a seed of trauma planted at the moment of conception, waiting for the right conditions to bloom. The public ritual, the concentrated fear and guilt of the entire town, had been the final ingredient. They had not been performing an exorcism to cast Elias Carter out. They had been performing a summoning, a dark baptism of shared sin, to invite the last, most terrible part of him all the way home. The chaos in the church did not end in a cathartic release. It simply guttered out, like a candle flame starved of air. The accusations and confessions subsided into ragged sobs, then into a thick, shame-filled silence. One by one, family by family, the people of Grayson Hollow shuffled out of the nave, not looking at each other, their faces pale and drawn. They had come seeking a communal victory over evil, a reaffirmation of their righteousness. Instead, they had been forced to witness a public autopsy of their own souls, with their darkest secrets laid bare by the voice of a child. They left the church a fractured and suspicious people, the bonds of their small community irrevocably broken. Father Hargrove remained standing at the altar, a lone figure in a desecrated space. The air was stale with the smell of sweat, fear, and the cloying, subterranean scent of wet earth. Snuffed candles stood like miniature black tombstones on the altar. A hymnal lay splayed on the floor, its pages trampled. He felt nothing. Not anger, not despair, not even fear. He felt only a vast, hollow emptiness, the profound exhaustion of a man who had not only lost a battle, but had discovered he was fighting on the wrong side, in a war he never understood. He had come to Grayson Hollow as a priest, an agent of light. He now felt like little more than an accomplice, a stage manager who had arranged the lighting for a tragedy he was powerless to stop. He did not sleep. Sleep was a luxury for those who still believed the world made sense. He sat in the cold rectory, the ticking of the broken pocket watch from his coat pocket, a solitary companion in the dark. It was a patient sound, a sound that had waited decades and was prepared to wait longer still. He did not pray for the soul of Samuel Thorne. He prayed that the boy had a soul left to pray for. Dawn arrived not as a promise of renewal, but as a slow, gray dilution of the darkness. It revealed a world washed of all color, a landscape of muted grays and browns. With the dawn came a visitor. Thomas Thorne stood on the rectory steps, his form a dark silhouette against the pale morning sky. The man's face was a ruin. The desperate resolve of the previous night was gone, replaced by a terrifying, hollow calm. It was the calm of a man who had passed through the crucible of all possible hope and had found nothing on the other side. He did not need to speak the words. Hargrove saw the truth in his dead eyes. The boy was gone. Together, they walked to the Thorn cabin in a silence that was heavier than any words. The air was still and cold, each of their footsteps a loud intrusion on the morning's grim peace. The cabin door stood ajar. Inside, the small home was filled with a profound and unnatural stillness. Martha Thorne sat at the small kitchen table, staring at a single, cold cup of tea. She did not look up as they entered. She was a statue of grief, frozen in the moment her world had ended. Thomas led Hargrove to the small back room that served as Samuel's bedroom. The priest steeled himself for a scene of chaos, of a desperate flight. What he saw was far more terrifying. The room was immaculate. The small cot, which had always been a mess of tangled blankets, was now made with an inhuman, geometric precision. The single, thin blanket was pulled taut, the corners folded at perfect right angles. It was the work of an intelligence that knew nothing of a child's restless sleep. It was the tidiness of a tomb, and on the center of the small, flat pillow, placed with the care of a jeweler arranging a precious gem, lay the rusted pocket watch. It was no longer in Hargrove's coat. It had returned to its master's domain. Its ticking seemed louder in the small, still room, a steady, triumphant pulse that filled the air. It was not a clue. It was a statement, a trophy left behind by the victor, a declaration that the transaction was complete. Later that day, what was left of the town's fragile hope was finally extinguished. The news came from a fisherman, a man who had braved the river at dawn. Downstream, about a mile from the town, he had found something snagged on the pale skeletal roots of a willow tree that dipped into the water. It was a small wool coat, Samuel's coat. A small search party was formed, a pathetic gesture of communal duty. They walked the riverbanks for hours, their calls sounding thin and desperate against the endless, murmuring rush of the water. They found nothing else, no footprints, no signs of a struggle, and no body. The Grayson River, as the midwife had warned, had a way of keeping its dead. The search was called off as dusk began to settle, the men returning to their homes with a silent, grim understanding. The boy was gone, taken by the same river that had claimed Elias Carter a decade before. The valley sealed itself in a new kind of silence, a silence born not of peace, but of shared guilt and a fear that was too deep to name. The doors of the church remained locked. No one dared to pray there now. That night, Father Hargrove lay on his cot in the rectory, fully clothed, staring into the darkness. He was no longer a priest. He was a keeper of a story, a warden of a haunted memory. He knew it was not over. The entity had achieved its goal. It had reclaimed the memory of its own death. It had settled its score with the boy who was born of its final moment. But the hatred that had fueled it for so long was a fire that could not be quenched so easily. He felt a change in the room's atmosphere, a sudden, plummeting cold that was now sickeningly familiar. He closed his eyes. He did not need to see. He knew he was no longer alone. He waited. And then, the voice came. It was not in the hallway. It was not behind his shoulder. It was everywhere at once, a disembodied whisper that seemed to emanate from the very air around his head. It was closer than breath. It was the cold, rasping voice of Elias Carter, no longer filtered through the throat of a child, but pure, raw, and unbound. It spoke 3 words, a quiet promise of a new and terrible gospel. One down. More to go. In that final chilling moment, Father Elias Hargrove understood the true nature of the horror he had unleashed. The ghost of Elias Carter no longer needed a host. Samuel had not been a possession. He had been an incubator, a vessel to nurture the memory back to its full strength. Now it was free. It was a hostless voice, a sentient plague that did not need a body or a mouth to speak. It could move through the valley like water through soil, seeping into the cracks of guilt and fear that riddled the souls of the townspeople. Every man who had stood on that riverbank, every person who carried a secret sin, was now a potential vessel, a potential mouthpiece for the endless, patient anger of the drowned man. The priest was trapped, not by the valley's geography, but by his own guilt, his own failure, making him just as vulnerable as the rest. The entity was not in a boy anymore. It was in the hollow itself. The case file on the possession of Samuel Thorne is now closed. Thank you for bearing witness with us. Join the community by subscribing, and you'll be here when we open the next one.